Hello, everyone. This week we are going to be looking at two thinkers who examine the relationship between society and individuals. And we're going to be doing this by looking at the question of structure versus agency. And so the question is basically, how much does the structure of society control the actions of individuals, right? So how much control does society have over, your life, my life, individuals' lives? And then conversely, how much agency do people have? That is, free will, essentially. How much ability do individuals have to make their own decisions, make their own actions? So how much are people constrained, and then how free are people? And so we're going to be looking at this today this week, by examining the question of structure versus agency. This is how sociology kind of frames this question. Today, we're going to be looking at it in terms of the work of British sociologist Anthony Giddens. So first, we're going to talk about his general theory called structuration theory. So you can see that in his reading, he likes to use a fair amount of jargon, which can be unfortunate sometimes. So he's come up with this term structuration theory. So we're going to examine that first, and then look at kind of some examples of this theory in his research on modernity, or what we might call actually late modernity, the 21st century, the late 20th century. And so see how that theory, relates to his view of what the contemporary society of the West is like. Okay, so first let's look at his overall general theory of structuration. So if you have your handout, you can kind of see some of the questions there, or some of the issues he's dealing with in that theory. So structuration theory is really set up to handle this question of structure versus agency. So to repeat a little, right, how much does the structure of society, how much influence does it have over people's lives versus how much freedom do people have to make their own decisions? So first we want to kind of have a brief understanding of what Giddens means by structure and what he means by agency. So by structure, he talks about what he says is resources and rules, right? So for him, structure is resources and rules. So rules are basically the norms, or the rules of social life, rules from kind of everyday etiquette all the way up to the legal code. And then resources is basically how are the resources of society distributed, right? So we can think of economic resources, or status, right? How is that organized or distributed within a society or group of people? And so basically the idea here is, every society creates a set of rules of, how to do things. This is what is right, this is wrong, but also more general rules like, this is what it means to get married. This is what it means to be a parent, right? So kind of just general kind of guidelines for social practices. And resources are, basically, how are the things that people value distributed in a society? And the basic idea is that every society will be organized in a certain way, right? Every society will have its own set of rules, its own set of practices, and will have its own way of organizing how the resources of a society are distributed among its members, right? So that's structure, resources, and rules. We can also think then about agency. And so agency is really the idea of the ability of a person to carry out an action, right? To carry out their desires, right? So, I want to do something, I want to accomplish something. If I have agency, then I have the ability or capability to, express that desire and to carry it through, right? I want to be an artist. Let's say, if I have agency, then I'm able to fulfill that desire or kind of accomplish it. So what Giddens says is that for a long time, this idea of structure and agency have been very opposed to one another. Like that you had these two camps. One camp was very much focused on structure. And they said, okay, yes, this is it, right? Society has these rules and resources. It's heavily structured and organized, and this controls people, right? It influences their actions, it influences their thoughts, it shapes what they do and what they can and cannot do, right? And he says, there's various examples of this. Sometimes Marxists, see individuals as being heavily controlled, right? Class consciousness, false consciousness, this type of thing. Structural functionalists also see people as heavily controlled, right? Their society has a certain function it's trying to do, and humans just carry out that program, right? So he says, on one hand, to structure people, they see humans as kind of puppets, right? Here's the structure of society, and here's the individual. Structure of society is kind of like the puppet master, and it's kind of controlling people's actions, socializing them, indoctrinating them, giving them, distributing resources, and people are heavily controlled. In the other camp, you have a group of people who emphasize human agency. And they say, oh, no, people are free. The human spirit, people can think for themselves. Every human has the ability to, make their own way in the world and think their own thoughts, right? Sometimes he talks about economics and economic theorists as adopting this type of philosophy. They talk about humans as being rational, right? That every human, has a cost-benefit analysis, and different humans have different costs and benefits, different things they desire, but everybody's able to fulfill them in a rational world. And if it's not rational, that's impeding people, right? So every person has different things, and as everybody being rational, then you can go out to the world and do what you want. But in general, what he's saying is, historically, there have been these two camps. One camp has been the structure people, who say that individuals are heavily controlled. Another camp is the agency people, saying that humans are free and can do whatever they want. What he says is, these are two false theories. They're too extreme on either end. And what he wants to do is come up with structuration theory to overcome this divide, to see neither people as overly controlled nor as completely free, right? And so he thinks that his theory of structuration is going to be able to overcome this, kind of argument that he thinks doesn't really exist and is not really a true one. So what is structuration theory? So the best way to understand it is to say that structure and agency are actually two sides of the same coin. Rather than being opposed to one another, they're actually need each other, right? That you need a social structure to have people to have free will and agency, and the agency and free will of people creates the structure of society. This is a little bit abstract, so let's kind of dig down a little bit deeper. So the best way to understand this is through two concepts. So the first one is this idea that structures, social structures, the rules and resources of society are not just constraining, but also enabling, right? So normally when we think of social structures, we just think of, how is it stopping us? How is it limiting what we want to do in the world? But what Giddens says is social structures don't just constrain us, they also give us freedom. They enable us to do things, right? That is through social structures that I'm able to accomplish my desires and fulfill the things that I want. It's through social structure that I'm able to have agency. Let me give you one example. Let's say, go back to this example of me wanting to be an artist, right? And so what Giddens would say is, well, look, that whole idea of art and artistry and being an artist, that's not something that just was, in your head and you created yourself. That is part of the structure of society, right? Art and the institution of art and creating art is something that was provided and created by society. And so if you have this desire in you to express something about yourself, how do you do that? Oh, you can do that through art. And so that social structure of art, the institution of art, is allowing you to express yourself, right? And so that's an example of the social structure, not just constraining what you do, but enabling you to do something, Let's pick another example. Let's say that you're an individual and you're romantically attracted to another human in the world, right? You like that human romantically, right? Again, the question becomes, well, how do you fulfill that action? How do you express that love, that romance, that kind of emotional desire in you to be connected to that other person, right? How do you do that? Again, society creates a structure, a set of social practices, a set of rules that enables you to express that romance, right? So, we can call this marriage, right? So marriage is something that is constraining, right? It limits, your freedom to do certain things, right? It limits you, but marriage is also enabling, right? It allows you to do things, it allows you to be in a romantic relationship with another person. Or, don't think of marriage, you think about just dating, right? But dating is also a social institution, right? Dating is also a social practice with rules, right? And so the general idea that Giddens is trying to get to is say that, look, social structure is not something that just stops people or limits them. Social structures are also things that frees people or enables them, it fulfills their life. Right? So that's the first thing. That's the first way that he overcomes this divide between social structure on the one hand and agency on the other hand. He says social structure is actually creating agency or providing for agency. Right? So that's the first thing. Social structures are enabling as well as constraining. What's another part of his theory? The most important part of his theory, or kind of really distilled down, is what he calls the duality of structures. So, and I have a little diagram in the handout to kind of like to spell this out. And so what he's trying to say here is there's actually two parts to structures. That's the duality, right? So what are the two parts? The two parts are structure on the one hand, right? We got that, and action, right? So human actions, we can just maybe call this agency. So on the one hand, he says, okay, look, it happens, there's a flow back and forth between structure and agency. So one part of that cycle is that structure, the organization of society, shapes human actions, right? So the way that society is organized creates or affects what humans do, right? That makes sense. But what he says is also true is that human actions, by humans doing things, creates the structures of society, right? The structures of society didn't just come out of nowhere, weren't just given to us by aliens, right? That we created the structure of society, humans. How did we do that? We created that through our actions. And so rather than just seeing structure as affecting actions, affecting human agency, we can also see that human agency, human actions create the structure of society. And this is continually ongoing, right? Right now, right in the present, structure is shaping actions, and actions are creating and reinforcing structures. Let's see an example of this, where examples help clarify these things. So let's talk about norms. So, norms or rules is one of the parts of the structure of society, right? So let's see kind of a clear example of norm. One really long-standing norm has been, which bathroom to use, which public bathroom to use, and that you're supposed to use the public bathroom of the gender or sex that you identify with. Right? So if you're a man, you go into the men's bathroom. If you're a woman, you go into the woman's bathroom, right? So we can see that this is part of the duality of structures. So, we can see the first part of structure, the agent's action. So we can say, okay, yes, society created this rule, right? Wanted to split up the genders and make them go into different bathrooms. It created this rule. And create separate bathrooms, physical structures to do this. Is part of the structure, physical structure of society. And so that structure, those rules and those physical places are affecting people's actions. right? When you want to go use the, use the bathroom in public, you now are compelled to use one of these bathrooms, right? It's also enabling because it allows you to use the bathroom, right? It, allows you to use, to fulfill your bodily functions, right? So, but what's also true, Giddens says, is that the actions of people are reinforcing that structure, right? So why do we believe in different bathrooms? Because people keep on going to different bathrooms. The actions of humans make people go keep that structure in place. So by men and women going to different bathrooms, so by men going to the men's bathroom and women going to the women's bathroom, it reinforces that structure. It keeps that structure going. And so that structure is created by the actions of humans. So the structure shapes the actions, but the actions creates and reinforces the structure. The clearest way we can see this actually is that recently, let's say in the last 3 to 4 years, that structure has actually kind of fallen apart a little bit, right? It's been broken down. There's been a kind of a reaction against this idea of separate bathrooms, right? Why? Because of the actions of people, right? The actions of individuals saying, look, I don't like these rules anymore. I just want to use the bathroom either that I identify with, or I don't, I don't think this matters anymore, right? And so the actions of people don't just have to reinforce the structure of society, it can actually also alter the structure of society, right? But also, then there's a debate back and forth and, et cetera, et cetera. But the main point here is that it goes both ways, right? The social structure shapes the actions of humans, but the actions of humans can reinforce or alter the structure of society, right? This is basically the idea of the duality of structure. And so in this way, what Giddens is trying to say is, rather than seeing structure and agency as opposing one another, as being on opposite sides, we can see that structure and agency are connected to each other, right? Structure doesn't just constrain, but also enables people's actions. And, that there's this kind of cycle back and forth between structure and action. Okay, so that's his general theory of structuration, kind of summarized a little bit briefly. There's more to it, but that's a condensed version. Let me now talk about his theory of the late modernity, right? So we can remember late modernity is the modernity of the late 20th and 21st century, right? So modernity goes from the 1600s onwards, but Giddens isn't really talking about, the 17th century or 18th century or 19th century. He's talking about now. He's talking about the late 20th century and the 21st century. What is typically called late modernity or sometimes postmodernity. And so just like Bauman from last week, right, he wants to describe what is late modernity like. What is it like to live in society now? And so whereas Bauman came up with this concept of liquid modernity, Giddens comes up with this different term, what he calls reflexive modernity, right? So reflexive modernity is, his concept of what our society is like now. And in some ways it's a little bit similar to Bauman, but, a different take. So, okay, what is reflexive modernity? So I'm going to describe it in general terms first, and then we're going to get more and more specific. So in general, it's this idea that social practices and social institutions are constantly being examined and reformed in light of new information, right? And so it's really this idea that we no longer just kind of accept doing things as they've always been done, like, oh, this is the way we do it, so we're going to keep on doing it that way. But we're constantly now in a process of reforming and altering, right? We're constantly kind of tinkering and adjusting our social practices and our social institutions to do them in a different way, right? And so the basic idea of reflexive modernity is that there's this kind of continual reworking of society, that we're kind of constantly remaking and redoing our structure of society, right? And so we can see it, this is kind of an example of this structure and action cycle, this duality of structure, that almost this cycle has sped up, right? Structure has affected action, but now action is going to alter and tinker with structure, and then structure is going to affect that action, and action is going to alter and tinker with it again. And so there's kind of this constant kind of reworking and readjustment of the structure of society. And I think, again, the bathroom, the debate over which public bathrooms people should use, that's an example of reflexive modernity. It used to be that people just accepted, they didn't think about it, this, men go here, women go there. But in reflexive modernity, we say, wait on a second, maybe we can do it differently. Maybe people can just use the bathroom that they choose. And maybe it doesn't have to do with their sex, it's their gender identity. It doesn't matter about where you land on this debate. The idea here is that the ability to think that we can adjust and change and alter the social practices of a society, that is reflexive modernity. Let me use let me dig a little bit more deeper into this and get some of his other concepts. So one of the main parts of reflexive modernity is this idea of what he calls detraditionalization. So what is traditions first? To see what's been detraditionalized, we have to first understand the idea of traditions, right? So we're going back to Weber now, traditional authority, right? So the basic idea of traditions is you do things the way they have always been done, right? That, why should we do it this way? Well, that's just always been the way that we do it, right? That we just keep on going with the structure that we have, right? And, in some ways, this connects also to the work of Berger and Luckman, right? This idea of the social construction of reality, right? So they talk about, how reality is constructed by people, right? That we construct social institutions like, say, marriage, right? But we don't realize that. We just take them for granted or for given, right? We say, okay, this is the structure of society. This is the way we've always done it, and this is the way we will always do it in the future, right? This is just the way it's been done, right? And we just accept that as being part of reality. But what Giddens is saying is that in late modernity, we have come to question that reality. We have come to realize, or we have come to this realization that society is socially constructed, right? We have come to realize that our social practices, our social institutions are artificial, meaning that we are the ones who created these things. And so the idea is, well, if we created them, if we are the creators of our own society, then we realize then we can recreate it, we can alter it, right? If we're the ones producing the structure, then we also, at the same time, when we realize that we are the creators, then we realize we can recreate, right? That we can alter practices. And so, example of this again is marriage, right? That what Giddens might say is that this idea of same-sex marriage is an example of the detraditionalization, right? If we think of traditional marriage as being between a man and a woman, right? This kind of, that's idea espoused, sometimes. Well, if that's traditional marriage, the idea of saying, okay, well, we live in a detraditional society means that you can break down that structure, you can, deconstruct the institution of marriage, and then reconstruct it in a different way. You can say, oh, it doesn't have to be a man and a woman, it can be two men, it can be two women, right? And so that's part of detraditionalization, and it's also part of reflexive modernity, right? That this kind of continual reworking is breaking down traditional structures and then fixing them and making them new. And we can think that, maybe with marriage, we will continue to rework it and tinker with it, right? Maybe in the future we'll say, okay, it doesn't have to be one person, doesn't have to be two people. It could be multiple, you know, you could have a marriage between 3 or 4 people, right? You know, it's not impossible to imagine, right? And what Giddens would say is that in reflexive modernity, you know, we now allow ourselves to do this. We now allow ourselves to change and alter the structure of society. What's part of this? So that's detraditionalization. Now we can talk about what's called the double hermeneutic. And so what's interesting here is that what Giddens says is that sociology and social sciences actually play a part in this process of reworking or process of breaking down traditions and then reworking them in a different way, reflexive modernity. He says what social science does is that first, it provides us with a knowledge that social institutions are artificial, right? It allows us to perceive the artificial nature of our social institutions, and then allows us, you know, gives us information and knowledge about how to, you know, alter them and rework them, right? And so he says that knowledge then, social science knowledge, becomes not just a description of social reality, of social world, but the social world takes that knowledge and then uses it to alter reality. And so rather than just simply being an outside observer, social science knowledge then actually becomes a tool or part of the reworking of society. So one example of this, again, is this kind of, I want to use an example just to kind of highlight the concept. And, you know, I'm not trying to, you know, get into the debate, you know, either way on this. But one concept is this idea of microaggressions, right? So the idea that some people of, you know, racial, ethnic minorities or other minority groups are stigmatized and discriminated against in kind of in small interpersonal ways, right? So it's not just, you know, big, large, you know, forms of discrimination that matter, but it's kind of interpersonal forms of discrimination. You know, people being excluded from a group, you know, let's say a study group or something like that, people being, you know, put down in subtle ways and insults. You know, that all the, you know, that discrimination is not something that just is experienced by people, you know, in big ways, but it experienced in interpersonal ways. So whatever you think about this concept of microaggressions, it's now a generally accepted term in society, right? You know, you see, you know, people talking about microaggressions. Where did this concept come from? This was a concept from sociology, right? That, you know, it was original sociologists and also some legal scholars who described and, you know, created this concept of microaggressions. And then this concept of microaggressions went from the academic world and academic speak into common parlance, right? Into the general way that we think about it. And so that's an example of the double hermeneutic, that, you know, this description of society by academics, right, went from just the academic world into the world that it describes. Right? And so, you know, again, and then becomes part of that reworking. It becomes part of that kind of tinkering of society, saying, hey, you know, microaggressions are something that are harmful to people and, you know, are problematic, and, you know, we should, you know, stop doing them, right? And that's, you know, that's altering the social practices of society. So all of this is a bit general. I want to now talk a little bit about, you know, connect this to your reading. And you can see in the reading that Giddens has this way of writing that is a little bit kind of jargony and a little bit pretty abstract in many ways. And so I'm trying to ground his reading in this theory, so it hopefully makes a little bit more sense. So he's not just interested in general society, he's also interested in individuals, right? You know, he's interested in how we think of ourself, right? How do individuals create their sense of self? And so he's going to talk again about the reflexivity of the modern self, right? So he calls this the reflective self. I mean, this is what he says is the type of self that is used or experienced in, you know, the contemporary world in the West. So what is this? What is the contemporary self? So he says, and this should sound familiar, is that the contemporary self, how our own self-image or self-identity is something that we constantly work at, right? It's not that you create a self, like, you're a teenager and you say, oh, I want to be this person, and then you're in your early 20s and you become that person and that's it, you're done. He says, no, now the self is something that you constantly work on, right? People constantly, continually think about, who am I? What kind of person should I be? How should I present myself? And so people are constantly or continually reworking, adjusting, and altering themselves and their self-presentation, right? Think about this in terms of clothing styles, right? That people now buy, a fair amount of clothes, to represent their self. And, every season, say every year, every 6 months, people will buy some new clothing. And what they're doing, Giddens would say, is they're just altering themselves a little bit. They keep on working on themselves. And so he says that the modern self is one that is continually self-reflective, continually thinking about themselves and trying to alter and adjust what they're like. And so it's this kind of continual process of reworking and making yourself. It's not just a sudden thing. It's not just you do this in a momentary crisis or something like that. Now it's continual. Now you rework yourself in the teenage years, in your 20s, and your 30s and 40s. Just keep on working at yourself. And what's interesting here is he says it's not just that you're free to do this, right? But it's that there is a sense of moral responsibility to do it. That there is this pressure to make yourself different, to be continually reworking yourself, to make yourself a better person. And so there's this kind of pressure to keep adapting and keep improving. He does this by looking at self-help books. And he says, the self-help books are really about self-improvement, that you have to keep making yourself better and improving yourself, right? You have to keep constantly tinkering and reworking who you are as a person and getting better. He says, this creates a certain amount of pressure and anxiety on people, and it comes with this idea that we now believe that the self can be altered, right? It used to be people were just like, oh, this is who I am, and that's it. I don't have to think about it anymore. But now we believe that the self, who we are, can be reworked, can be changed, can be altered. We realize that the self is not something set in stone, but it's something fluid. And once we realize that, then we say, oh, well, if it's fluid, if it can be changed, then I can improve it. I can make myself a better person. But along with that comes a certain degree of pressure and anxiety to make yourself a better person. One thing he examines in this is the concept of the body, how we bring our body into this, right? He says, now the body, the human body, is part of this reworking. So, the example, again, back to the clothes that we wear, that we have to present ourselves in a nice way, we have to look professional at work. But it's also, our hairstyles, our skin, our, body odor, all this stuff, that we feel like ourself is something that we have to work on, and we work on it through our body, right? We have to present ourselves and manage our body, in a way to make sure that we are a good, presentable self to others. And so you can see a lot of this in the reading, right? That the self is not something set in stone, but it's something that we work on, we develop and alter. What else? The last thing he talks about in terms of kind of interpersonal things, or personal nature of social life, the individual experience, is relationships. So he says, what are relationships? What are human relationships like in late modernity? And he's particularly focusing on romantic relationships, right? And so he says that romantic relationships have become what he calls pure relationships, right? What he means by this is that they are entered into based solely on emotional connection, right? That a person perceives that the relationship should give them an emotional reward, that there should be some kind of emotional connection between the participants. And that along with this, there's a kind of continual monitoring of the relationship, right? That couples will continually have this discussion of, oh, how is the relationship going? Are we in a good place? People will have the talk, they'll talk about, that they are in a relationship. And so it's this idea that a relationship isn't just something that you do, that you, oh, well, we're just doing it. No, a relationship is now something that you work at, that you try to make better, that you try to improve, right? And again, he talks about how you can have, self-help books, right? About how you make your relationship better or whatever. And so he says, all of this is part of reflexive modernity, a part of how we alter and try to rework social institutions like marriage, but also our everyday interpersonal experiences, our sense of self, and also our relationships. And so the reflexive modernity is really this example of this continual reworking and altering of society. And it's a good example, again, to bring it back and to conclude, it's a good example of his structuration theory, right? It shows the connection between structure and action, and it shows how structures are both enabling and constraining.